You've been such a pillar here. Irene, we just think it's time for a new direction.
That's what Derek Vaughan, our CEO, told me on a rainy Tuesday morning. He said it with the same slick smile he used during press briefings and networking galas, a smile that made you feel like you were being thanked, while simultaneously being shown the door. I had been at Vaughan and Liddell for 22 years. I started when the company had folding chairs for conference rooms and fax machines that jammed every 20 pages. I built entire departments from scratch. I trained half of our senior staff. I kept things running through 3 acquisitions, 2 crises, and 1 federal audit. But none of that mattered now. Not to Derek. I want you to help us transition gracefully, he said. Train the next generation. Someone fresh. Someone who can take us into the future. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply asked, "Who?" He tapped on his tablet and turned the screen toward me. Madison Keene, bright young talent. Wharton grad. Think you'll like her? I nodded slowly. When do I start training her? He smiled, like I'd just passed a test. Next week. What he didn't say, but I knew perfectly well, was that once I trained her, I'd be gone. Early retirement. He'd call it a celebrated departure. Maybe a catered farewell lunch and a plaque that would gather dust in the HR closet. But I had no intention of disappearing quietly. That afternoon, I returned to my office and looked out the window. The same view I'd had for 12 years. Same skyline. Same dusty blinds, but everything had changed. I wasn't just being phased out, I was being replaced, and I was expected to smile through it. I glanced at the photos lined up on my bookshelf, snapshots from conferences, signed cards from interns, a note from one of the senior partners who once said, "I wouldn't have survived my first year without you." I'd kept that one taped inside my desk drawer for nearly a decade. Quiet validation, the kind that doesn't come with a title. I dusted it off. Madison arrived the following Monday, bright-eyed, sharp-suited, and polite in a way that felt genuine. She shook my hand firmly and said, "I've heard amazing things about you." I smiled. "Let's make sure you learn something useful before they kick me out." She laughed, unaware I wasn't joking. We started slow. I walked her through operations, showed her the internal databases, our vendor logic, crisis protocols. She took notes on paper, which I respected, and asked good questions. But what struck me most was how little she knew about what really happened here. She didn't know that Derek had slashed the maternity policy in 20 to boost shareholder optics. She didn't know he cut the safety compliance team in half right before an OSHA inspection. She didn't know that his most trusted executive had once siphoned client data into a private firm before being quietly let go with a non-disclosure check. She knew spreadsheets, but not skeletons. And so, I taught her both, not directly. I didn't badmouth anyone. That would have been unprofessional. But I showed her the real org charts, not the ones on SharePoint. I walked her through the logic behind every decision Derek had made for growth. I opened archived memos with red lines that told a very different story than what was on the press releases. And she listened, really listened. "Why didn't the board push back on this?" she asked one afternoon, reading a document where Derek had proposed outsourcing half our domestic staff. "Because Derek knows how to make a bad idea sound like innovation," I said. Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. By the end of her second week, she had stopped asking where to click. She started asking why things were the way they were. She noticed which departments were overfunded and which ones hadn't replaced staff in 3 years. She asked about the missing expense reports from Q4 of last year. "I think it's just archived," I said, "but the trail's fuzzy, isn't it?" She nodded slowly. "It's like someone doesn't want it found." I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. On a quiet Thursday, we stayed late reviewing vendor contracts. Most people had gone home. The overhead lights dimmed. Madison leaned back in her chair and looked at me across the table. "Why are you really helping me?" I paused, thought carefully, then answered, "Because you have something I didn't have when I started here." She tilted her head. "What's that?" "The power to change things before they break you." She sat with that for a long time, then quietly said, "Derek doesn't want me to know everything, does he?" I didn't reply. I didn't have to. From that point forward, something shifted. She began asking for records on her own. She requested audit logs. She started cross-referencing contracts I hadn't even mentioned. Not loudly, not defiantly, just deliberately. She was thinking like me now, but younger, sharper, and with one thing I never had: time. I had trained her well, and Derek Vaughan had no idea what was coming. Some people carry a file. I carried a memory. For years, I kept my head down and my drawer locked, not out of fear but survival. You see, it's one thing to know what's wrong. It's another thing to prove it when you're just a nameplate with no title behind it. Back in 2017, I found a billing discrepancy that didn't sit right with me. A vendor, Allmont Consulting, was getting paid twice for the same scope of work. I flagged it to Derek in a confidential email, asking if it was a miscommunication between departments. He didn't reply, but 2 days later, I'd accidentally revoked my database access. I got the message, so I printed everything, stored it off-site. The invoices, the edits, the red lines, and the approval stamps, all signed by Derek Vaughan. I never blew the whistle, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew what happened to the last person who tried. Her name was Janice Pearson. She was head of procurement, fierce, meticulous, and well-respected until she wasn't. In early 2016, she brought up a conflict of interest involving Derek's cousin's logistics firm. The cousin's company had just landed a lucrative contract with us, one that bypassed the usual bidding process. Janice documented it, reported it, escalated it, and 3 weeks later, she was let go during a departmental reorganization. They gave her a quiet severance and wiped her name off the internal portal like she'd never existed. No farewell, no acknowledgement, just silence. I remember cleaning out her desk. She didn't even come back for her mug. After that, I stopped thinking about truth. I thought about rent, college tuition, keeping my health benefits. I didn't stay because I was weak. I stayed because I was raising a daughter, and silence was the safest insurance I had. But now, Madison was different. She didn't just dig, she connected dots. Her mind worked fast, and her questions got sharper by the day. One morning, she asked about a consulting fee paid to Pinnacle Growth Group, a name I hadn't heard in years. I blinked. Where'd you see that? Old vendor payment summary. The name stood out. They were only used once, and the amount was nearly 6 figures. I sipped my tea. They were involved in something big, weren't they? I nodded. 2018 expansion planning, but we never expanded. She frowned. Then what did they bill for? Exactly. I didn't give her the documents, not yet. But I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I unlocked my drawer. Inside was a plain manila folder, yellowed at the edges. No labels, just a stack of quiet truths. That night, I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling and remembered the day I almost went to the press. The day I printed out everything and sat in my car with the engine off for over an hour, just staring at the envelope. Then I remembered my daughter calling me that night, asking if we could still go on our planned trip to Washington, D.C. for her birthday, and I remembered sealing that folder instead of sending it. The next morning, Madison came in early, earlier than usual, no coffee in hand, no earbuds, just a focused look and a notebook. I found something else, she said. Derek signed off on 3 contracts that had 0 review from legal, and I checked the legal team didn't even have copies. That's not surprising, but it's against policy. That's not surprising either. She stared at me for a long moment. Irene, did you ever consider reporting him? I paused. That question hit harder than I expected. Every day, I said quietly, and every day, I chose to stay instead. Why? I folded my hands. Because sometimes, exposing the truth means setting yourself on fire and hoping someone notices the smoke. And I had a daughter to raise. Madison was quiet. Then she asked, "Do you still have the matches?" I looked at her, long and hard. Then I reached into my bag and handed her the folder. "Don't copy it," I said. "Read it and decide who you want to be." She stayed late that evening. I passed her desk around 7:15, and she was still there, highlighter in hand, flipping pages, cross-referencing line items against audit summaries. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The next day, she requested a private meeting with internal compliance. She told me afterward, "I didn't use your name," she said. I nodded. "You didn't have to." Things moved fast after that. Too fast. Within 72 hours, I was called into HR for a quick review of past departmental procedures. They smiled. They asked casual questions. They said it was routine, but I knew the script. They thought I was the leak. I played along. I gave vague answers. I smiled politely. And when I left the room, I knew exactly what would happen next. They'd watch me, check my emails, interview my team, try to pin something on me. But this time, I wasn't alone. Madison walked into Derek's office 2 days later. I don't know what she said, but the door stayed closed for almost an hour. When she walked out, she looked calm, focused, like someone who had just stepped off a ledge and landed safely. That evening, she slipped a note into my inbox. He asked if I was trying to destroy him. I said no, I'm just trying to rebuild what he hollowed out. I smiled, not because she said it, but because she finally understood. I had never needed her to avenge me. I needed her to believe me. And now, for the first time in years, someone did. She didn't just see the rot. She wasn't afraid to name it. And now, she was ready to act. It wasn't the first time I'd been called into HR. But this time, it felt different. There were no coffee mugs on the table, no welcome smiles, just 2 people I barely knew. Monica Fields from compliance, and a new junior partner from legal sitting stiffly, hands folded, eyes rehearsed. Irene, Monica began, this is just a standard internal review, nothing formal. We're talking with several department heads as part of a routine oversight process. Routine, that word again. I nodded, letting them believe I bought the script. The truth, I had written that script a dozen times over the years, on behalf of people like them. For people like Derek, we just want to clarify a few historical items, said the younger one, Elliot. I think, fresh suit, fresh nervousness. They started easy. Were you involved in the 2018 vendor selection process for the Pinnacle contract? I was looped into implementation, not selection. Did you ever raise concerns about payment duplication during that period? Yes. I flagged 2 discrepancies via email in June of that year. Monica raised an eyebrow. Do you have a copy of that email? No, I said. It wiped my archive shortly after a system migration. That was true. What I didn't say was, I printed it before they could. They shifted forward slightly, probing. Have you ever discussed any internal financial matters with employees outside your department? I tilted my head. Defined discussed. Shared confidential materials. Voiced concerns. Speculated about misconduct. I've always trained staff to follow documented procedure and report through proper channels. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't the no they were hoping for either. They were fishing, and I knew why. Something Madison had said must have landed. They suspected me, but they didn't know. So I let them circle, let them sweat through polite accusations and veiled warnings, let them scribble on their yellow legal pads, while I sipped their lukewarm tea and gave them nothing. Because while they asked me questions I'd expected, they weren't ready for mine. At the end of the session, I stood and adjusted my coat. Then I looked at Monica and asked, casually, have you reviewed the final signatures on the Evergreen Logistics renewal from Q2 last year? She blinked. Excuse me, only asking, I said. I noticed the contract was pushed through without countersignature. Curious who authorized it. The junior attorney's pen froze mid-word. I smiled. Thank you both for your time. Then I walked out, leaving silence behind me like a dropped match. That afternoon, the air in the office changed. No one said anything directly, but the tension moved through the hallways like a scent unseen, but undeniable. People who used to breeze past my desk now avoided eye contact. Others lingered by the printer longer than usual, whispering between copies. Lydia, my longtime assistant, slipped into my office with a post-it note that simply read, "They're watching your inbox." I nodded, and still, I said nothing, because what HR didn't expect was that this wasn't a reaction. It was a rehearsal. Madison, meanwhile, kept her face clean. She smiled in meetings, shared light jokes with colleagues, but I noticed the difference in her eyes. They'd sharpened, focused. She was moving with intention now. 3 days after my HR meeting, I found a new document on my desk. No note, no signature, just a folder marked Cross-Departmental Audit Suggestions Draft. It wasn't company issued. I knew Madison's formatting, the spacing, the way she used italics sparingly, and her habit of listing things in threes. Inside the folder were proposed audit pathways tied to the very contracts I'd warned her about. Almont Consulting, Pinnacle, Evergreen. She wasn't accusing anyone. She was building a case. That day, Derek returned from what had been described as a strategic leadership off-site. Translation, he'd been laying low. He walked past my desk without looking at me. I watched the tension in his shoulders, the stiffness in his walk. He knew, maybe not everything, but enough to realize something had shifted. He called an impromptu meeting with the executive team. Madison was invited. I was not. For once, I didn't mind. At 6:47 p.m. Long after most had gone home, Madison knocked on my door. Irene, she said softly, they've offered me interim authority over vendor relations. I raised an eyebrow. Already, she nodded. They want to get ahead of whatever they think is coming. Do they suspect you? They're not sure. But they know someone knows. And you, she hesitated. I'm not scared of them. I'm scared I'll let you down. I looked her in the eye. You're not here to protect me. You're here to finish what I couldn't. She sat down and pulled out her notebook, then helped me plan my next move. And for the first time in 2 decades, I didn't feel like I was whispering into the void. I was speaking to someone who would not only listen, she would act. Most audits are about compliance. This one was about survival. It began on a Wednesday morning with a single email. Subject, Internal Review, Vendor Process Compliance. From Madison Keene. To Finance. Legal. Procurement. As part of my transition into the interim vendor operations role, I'll be initiating a review of 3 active contracts for standard due diligence and process consistency. I appreciate your cooperation and transparency. No mention of wrongdoing, no finger-pointing, just due diligence. But I knew exactly what she was doing. She was shaking the tree quietly, methodically, and waiting to see which branches dropped first. Derek's name wasn't in the message, but he read it within 15 minutes. I knew because Lydia texted me. He's pacing. By noon, the whispers had started. Did you hear? She's digging through Pinnacle. Why those 3 vendors? Is this Derek's initiative? Is this a real audit or something else? The ambiguity was part of the power. People didn't know who had approved it, and that uncertainty kept them cautious. But Derek wasn't cautious. He was cornered. That afternoon, he sent out a company-wide update. All audit-related questions must be routed through executive leadership. No direct outreach unless authorized. A transparent power grab disguised as protocol. But Madison didn't blink. She replied all, absolutely. I'm happy to review findings with executive leadership after standard review procedures are completed. Translation, I'm not stopping, but I'll let you pretend you're still in charge. 2 days later, I found her in the break room, laptop open, vendor binder spread out, post-it notes layered like scales across the pages. She looked calm, focused, but her jaw was set too tight to be relaxed. They're circling, she murmured. Who? Derek. Legal. I think even 2 board members. What have you found? Duplicate payments, altered terms, vendor addresses tracing back to P.O. boxes in Wyoming and Arizona states. We don't operate in. She looked up. Why didn't anyone stop this? I took a breath, because stopping it meant sacrificing your career, and no one thought the system would protect them. She held my gaze for a long moment. Do you think it'll protect me? I didn't answer, because I didn't know, but I hoped. God, I hoped. That night, she didn't stay late alone. The director of finance, Kenneth Wills, grey-haired, close to retirement, slipped into her office at 6:30. I watched through the glass as they spoke. He looked uneasy. She looked resolute. They stayed until after 8. When he walked past my desk, he paused and said, "Your replacement. She doesn't scare easy. She listens harder than anyone I've seen in years." Then he added, almost to himself, "I think she might pull this off." The following Monday, Madison submitted a formal request for historical approval logs from legal. 3 contracts, 4 years, over $1, $2 million in strategic service payments. She didn't accuse. She didn't speculate. She simply documented, and it was enough to trigger a closed-door session with the audit committee. Derek knew the pressure was mounting. His movements changed. He smiled too much, shook hands too long, showed up to meetings he normally delegated. Then he called her in. That meeting lasted 47 minutes. When Madison emerged, she looked different, not shaken, not smug, unburdened. She came straight to my office. He tried charm first, she said, pulling out a chair. Then guilt, then threats. What did he say? That I was risking my future, that I was making enemies, that I didn't understand the bigger picture. And she smiled. I told him the bigger picture was rotting from the inside out. I stared at her. He'll retaliate. I know, and you're not afraid. I'm afraid, she said, but not of him. I'm afraid if I stop now, I'll become what everyone else became: quiet, complicit, tired. By Thursday, the retaliation began. Someone leaked a complaint to HR claiming Madison had exceeded her authority, disrupted executive workflows, and created a hostile reporting structure. It was the same language they'd used for Janice, the same vague toxicity meant to create doubt without evidence. Madison was summoned to HR. Before she went, she stepped into my office and asked, "If this is it, if they find a way to push me out, do you regret giving me that folder?" I shook my head slowly. "No, I regret not giving it to someone like you years ago." She gave me a soft smile, then walked out the door. I watched the clock. 1 hour passed. Then, 90 minutes. When she came back, her face was unreadable, but trailing behind her 3 steps back was Monica from HR, and Monica didn't look angry. She looked humbled. Later that evening, I found a sealed envelope in my inbox. No name, no label, just my initials. Inside, a single line written in Madison's hand. They wanted to isolate me, but I reminded them I wasn't alone. In companies like ours, isolation was the oldest tactic in the book. You don't fire someone immediately. You make them irrelevant. Remove them from group emails. Stop inviting them to meetings. Make sure their seat is still there, but their voice isn't. That's what Derek tried to do to Madison. The day after her HR review, I noticed her name missing from the updated internal calendar for strategic meetings, then from 2 executive chains, then from the invite list for a quarterly finance review she was supposed to lead. He wasn't pushing her out. He was erasing her. But what he didn't count on was us, the ones who had been erased before, the ones who still remembered what integrity used to look like. It started small. Kenneth Wills, the finance director, forwarded her the meeting minutes she'd been excluded from. Then Allison Chen from legal walked into my office, and closed the door. I got told not to send Madison the updated vendor logs, she said. It came from upstairs. I raised an eyebrow. She slid me a flash drive, so I'm giving them to you. Later that afternoon, Lydia, my assistant, slipped Madison a folder before anyone could see. They're trying to ice you, she whispered. But you're not on the ice alone. Within a week, the undercurrent was unmistakable. Madison had become something Derek never anticipated. Respected, not because of her title, but because she was consistent. She didn't gossip. She didn't retaliate. She didn't fold. Instead, she listened. She asked the right questions. She gave credit. And slowly, quietly, people began to close ranks around her, not with slogans or standoffs, but with access. People started sending her data by mistake, asking for her take off the record, inviting her to coffee chats, team huddles, and budget prep meetings, even when her name wasn't on the sheet. The departments weren't rebelling. They were realigning. Derek, meanwhile, grew paranoid. He began showing up to smaller meetings, interrupting junior staff with fake warmth and overused jokes. He'd clap people on the back and say things like, "Teamwork's the only ship that doesn't sink." Right, but the laughter was thin, and the silences longer. I watched him falter, not from exposure yet, but from irrelevance. The man who once ruled through charm and fear now looked like a placeholder in his own empire. One morning, Madison walked into my office holding a spreadsheet. "It's the Evergreen contract again," she said. "There's a backdated amendment signed with initials that don't match anyone in procurement or legal." I looked at the cell she pointed to. It had Derek's old assistant's initials, Elaine. "She left in 2020, I said. "Exactly. But the amendment is dated 6 months after that." We stared at it for a beat. Then she said something I'll never forget. "I used to think the rot was policy. Now I know it's habit." That week, we gathered in a rarely used conference room on the 15th floor. Present were Madison, Kenneth Finance, Allison Legal, myself, and, surprisingly, Tomas Rivera from IT Security. Tomas had been silent for years, but that day, he brought with him archived emails, recovered threads from 2018 and 2019, showing informal approvals for vendor shifts, some of which led directly to personal accounts. "This isn't just policy failure," he said. "This is criminal." Madison took a breath. "Are you willing to go on record?" Tomas looked at me. "Are you?" I nodded. He slid over a drive. "Then so am I." Derek felt the shift. You could see it in his pace. Faster, harder. He barked more than joked now. He sent 6 memos in 1 week. And in a move so transparently desperate, he announced an optional leadership retreat for selected department heads. Madison's name was not on the invite. Neither was mine. But Kenneth declined. Allison had a conflict. Tomas said he was booked solid. And Lydia simply wrote, "Thank you, but I report to someone else now." Derek tried to isolate her, but we closed ranks, not out of rebellion, out of respect. Because when people are tired of being afraid, they don't raise fists. They raise each other. That Friday, as the office thinned out before a long weekend, I found Madison alone in the stairwell, staring out the window at the river. She didn't say anything right away. Then softly, "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" I looked at her, this young woman they'd once tried to make my replacement. "No," I said. "You're doing the necessary thing. And sometimes that's harder." She nodded. "I keep thinking about Janice." "So do I." We stood in silence. 2 women from different generations, joined not by ambition but by conscience. And for the first time, I didn't feel old. I felt part of something finally coming together. There are moments in your career when you know deep in your bones that everything is about to shift. That morning, I knew. The boardroom was colder than usual, not from the air conditioning, but from what wasn't being said. At the head of the table sat Derek Vaughan, suit pressed, smile perfect. But his eyes darted too quickly. He knew the meeting wasn't his. The quarterly review had been scheduled weeks prior, but the tension in the room had nothing to do with earnings. Today wasn't about numbers. It was about exposure. I took my usual seat along the side wall, not at the table. That was never my place. But Madison, she was at the table now, directly across from Derek. The board members filed in, some neutral, some skeptical, and 2 I knew were watching her closely. She opened the meeting with calm professionalism. "Thank you for being here. Today, I'd like to begin with a brief overview of the internal audit my team initiated 3 weeks ago. You'll find copies of the preliminary report in front of you." They opened the folders. Silence. Then pages turning, eyes narrowing. And then, the question started. Why wasn't this flagged sooner? Who approved this vendor? This address doesn't exist. Derek straightened, voice confident. "I'd like to clarify that many of these contracts predate Madison's time here. Some were legacy relationships, standard practice. But Thomas Rivera from MIT spoke up. Standard practice doesn't explain forged signatures or redirected payments. Alison Chen added, nor does it explain why legal never received final documentation. For the first time, Derek looked small. He adjusted his cufflinks. These are isolated mistakes. If anything, we should be questioning the internal controls. Madison didn't raise her voice. She just leaned forward and said, Sir, you signed off on all 3 of those contracts. In one case, on a date, your assistant had already resigned. In another, the contract was pushed through without a legal review, against company policy. He blinked. Are you accusing me of misconduct? I'm not accusing you, she said. I'm presenting the evidence. It speaks for itself. And then she turned to me. Irene, would you please walk the board through the evergreen contract process as it existed in 2018? Every head turned. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I stood up. I stepped beside the projector screen and pulled out the folder. The folder, the one I'd kept buried for years. And for the first time in my career, I didn't whisper the truth. I spoke it. Evergreen Logistics was approved under an emergency procurement order, citing competitive urgency. But the urgency was manufactured. We had 2 lower bids waiting. They were never even reviewed. I clicked through the slides Madison had prepared. Audit trails, signature mismatches, duplicate invoice entries, vendor addresses that routed through dummy corporations. This wasn't a mistake. I said, this was designed. Derek laughed, not loudly, but the kind of laugh people use when they realize the tide's already gone out. You really think the board is going to act on a secretary's word? I turned to face him, calm, steady. I was never just a secretary. I was the one who made this place run while you played visionary. He stood. This is a setup. No, said Madison, rising to meet him. This is accountability. Board member 3. Miss Reynolds cleared his throat. We've seen enough. The room emptied slowly. Derek tried to plead, to pivot, but the faces had changed. Respect doesn't beg. It simply walks out of the room and takes the power with it. An emergency board vote was called. By afternoon, Derek Vaughan was suspended pending investigation. By the end of the week, he'd resigned for personal reasons. That Friday, the office felt lighter, not jubilant, but relieved. People moved differently, shoulders less tense, smiles more genuine. Even the elevators seemed quieter. Madison came by my desk around 5:30. They offered me the permanent role, she said. Head of vendor oversight, full access, final say. And she smiled. I said yes, on one condition. I raised an eyebrow. That you come with me, as senior advisor. I blinked. You want me back at the table? No, she said. I want to build a new table, and you're the first name on it. We sat by the window that evening, same chairs, same view, but this time, it felt earned, not given, not tolerated, built. I used to think silence was safety, I told her, and now I know silence is a prison. She looked out the window. Well, she said, you're free now. True leadership doesn't always sit at the head of the table. It often works silently in the background, holding everything together. Irene Mallory taught us that integrity, patience, and quiet strength can outlast titles and outshine ego. When injustice tries to erase you, your values become your voice. By empowering someone younger to speak the truth she once had to bury, Irene rewrote her legacy not with revenge, but with purpose. The lesson: never underestimate the one taking notes. They might be writing the plan that saves the company and exposes the rot at its core.